Well, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Well, President Biden's American Jobs Plan would make a huge investment in our infrastructure here in the United States. At a high level, what are some of the economic benefits of investing in a more sustainable infrastructure?
There are two big issues. One is that for decades, we just have not kept pace with our transport system, our rail, our fiber. So we don't have the infrastructure for a 21st century modern economy. We've just underinvested. There's a second issue, and that is that we need an infrastructure that is climate safe as well in two different ways. One, that it's not adding to global warming, and second, that it is resilient to the kinds of climate shocks that we're being buffeted with now every year. So we need a much smarter infrastructure, both for our competitiveness, good jobs, global trade, daily life, but we also need to make sure that this is a climate safe infrastructure, and especially that it uh, helps to achieve President Biden's proper objective of decarbonizing the US economy by mid century.
What do you see as some of the main goals of this plan?
I think when it comes to the energy sector and decarbonization, the main point is that we have to shift from coal, oil, and natural gas as the primary energy sources of the US economy to wind, solar, hydro, some biomass, basically to sustainable energy sources. So we need a big buildup, especially of solar. We have a lot of solar power. We have a lot of wind potential. And the Biden administration rightly is pointing to the big breakthroughs in offshore wind, figuring out how to make giant wind turbines off the coast that are stable in the middle of stormy oceans that can really work, because that's a lot of energy. It's all zero carbon, it's climate safe, and now we have ways to tap it. So it's moving the energy sector and the energy using sectors of the economy. Which are those? Transport, to move to electric vehicles; buildings, to move to using electricity for hot water and for heating our homes rather than heating oil, for example; and for industry, moving to electrification of industrial processes, or using that clean, green electricity to produce hydrogen or other green fuel source for the industrial sector. These are the key steps. And the first round of infrastructure addresses these as starting points, but we've got a long way to go from a fossil fuel based economy to a zero carbon economy.
Well, in your 2015 book, The Age of Sustainable Development, you wrote that the objectives of sustainable development are economic prosperity, social inclusion and cohesion, environmental sustainability, and good governance. How do you see the American Jobs Plan start to address these issues?
First, we have to make up for lost time. We have not been on a sustainable development course for the United States, actually, for decades. And things got a lot worse under Trump. Uh, so our economy is becoming more and more unequal. We see this in the mega wealth at the top of the wealth curve. We see it in the income distribution gaps between the haves and the have-nots. So the inequality has been rising, and the environmental damages have been going up because we haven't been attending to them. So mega forest fires, floods, droughts, blackouts, brownouts, you name it. The infrastructure is not keeping up. And we've been a major contributor to global climate change, to the global warming. And in this sense, we haven't been on the right course for a very long time. Why is it? Well, because we lost the idea of responsibility. We said, go out and make money, uh, and that's the be all and end all of it. And making money is one thing, but having a safe world and a society that holds together is another thing. I'm not against us making more money, but if it is detached from basic social fairness, and if it's detached from basic environmental sustainability, it's doing us no favor. So, really, the Biden administration is the first decisive change in the right direction for 40 years. It's a big deal what's happening right now.
Well, how do you think addressing environmental and climate problems leads to greater equity, and a more just society?
Well, first of all, we can't have justice if we're destroying ourselves. And there's no justice in COVID 19, that's for sure. It's a human disaster, 550,000 American deaths. And it is a reflection of environmental uh, complete disequilibrium, complete degradation, because this kind of pandemic is what the experts call a zoonotic event. It means that this is a disease that was in horseshoe bats and it got its way to humans. And that's happening more and more because when humans disrupt the natural environment, we also come into contact with pathogens, with viruses or bacteria or other disease causing agents that we were not experienced with. That happened with HIV, that happened with SARS, that happened with Ebola, that happened with MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. Now it's happened with COVID. So we can't even think about fairness if we're facing disaster because the amount of suffering is so large. We can't really think about fairness if our society is in turmoil from climate change. We're seeing so-called billion-dollar events. That means when the damages are $1 billion or more from one event, one storm, one flood, one drought, one hurricane. And we're seeing an incredible increase in the frequency of these billion-dollar events in the United States, forest fires, the scale of which we've never seen before. Yeah, they hit rich places as well as poor places. Everybody's vulnerable, but the amount of suffering is just so large that if we continue on this path, we're not going to achieve any kind of justice, much less distributive justice. But many of these challenges hit the poor hardest just by virtue of the fact that when you're poor, you don't have a margin. If you're pushed under, you don't have the safety margin. And in the pandemic, we know that it's been the poor workers who had to go out there every day, frontline workers. They got more infected. They suffered more deaths. If you have comorbidities, in other words, poor people tend to have other illnesses, they became much more vulnerable to COVID 19. And so, in general, when things are bad, poor people suffer more. So, the first rule is get out of these big crises, stay safe. And we really need to do that.
Well, one of the ways that President Biden has proposed paying for this plan is he's called for raising the corporate tax rate and introducing a global minimum tax. So, what are your thoughts on a global minimum tax?
Well, bravo. And I want it to be even more than minimum because uh, a few things. One is we say it's raising the corporate tax, but actually it is partly reversing a massive tax cut. So there's nothing of hardship in this for companies. They were paying 35% corporate tax rate before 2017. Then along came Trump, who didn't care at all about any of this stuff. And he cut the taxes to 21%. But my God, at the time, it was obvious that we couldn't afford that. that it was the wrong move, that it was adding to the inequalities, that it was busting open the budget. And what President Biden is proposing to do is to take the rate only partway back. If he had said 35%, you would still not even want to call it a tax cut. You'd want to call it reversing what we couldn't have afforded uh, and what we couldn't afford back in 2017. So that's one part. The second part is the tax system is just a scandal. It is made by design for loopholes that are sometimes shocking. And one of the shocking points is how much of our industry and our high tech sectors and our pharmaceutical companies are domiciled where? In the United States, where all their workers, their management, their factories, their research is? No. How about Bermuda, Cayman Islands, uh, British Virgin Islands? Well, huh? Why there? And the answer is not so hard to figure out. It's a tax haven. It's a tax dodge. And it's so outrageously unjustified. Sometimes I can't even believe what I learned, even though I'm, as a grown up, supposed to know this stuff a long time ago. But I was tracking the abusive pricing behavior of a giant drug company in America, Gilead, which has a fantastic drug that it bought for fighting hepatitis C, which is a killer liver disease. And it's been charging, when it started and introduced that drug, it charged 1,000 times the production cost because it had a
Wow.
patent, it had a monopoly. And I was incensed because this was a rip roaring epidemic that needed to be brought under control. There was a lot of suffering, especially among American veterans who had the disease. So I started to look. And then in the middle of it, I realized not only was Gilead price gouging on the drug, but where were the profits being booked? In Ireland and the Caribbean. Are you kidding? Ireland? They didn't do any of the research there. But the way that our tax code works is that through not even very clever manipulations, you can stick your intellectual property someplace that it has no business being. And then the company pays big royalties internally to use that intellectual property, thereby shifting the profits from the US market, where the drug was being used, where it had been developed, where it was owned, where it was produced, shifting it to Ireland. Come on, stop. Don't we have an IRS that says, no, you should not be doing that? And so this minimum tax is the minimum that we can do to be cleaning up this abuse. Of course, there are a lot of high-priced lawyers and congressmen that get campaign contributions, but you can understand why we have this system. But what's shocking is it isn't subtle. It isn't even close to being subtle. It's just awful. And we have to stop being awful. We have to start doing things right.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We've been talking a lot about modern monetary theory on this podcast. And, I personally love this idea that, the federal budget is a moral document and we should be able to spend for the society that we want. But obviously, when you have massive infrastructure investment that is going to make the economy more just and hopefully more sustainable, one of the only possible downsides is that it could lead to higher inflation, or the Fed would be able to, would need to step in and increase interest rates, which could then lead to less private investment. Do you think Congress can spend another $2 trillion and still avoid hyperinflation or significantly higher interest rates?
Well, look, deficit spending for all of this stuff is great for me, but not so good for you. And the reason is, you're going to be servicing this debt in the future. I'm an older guy, and frankly, you should be saying to me, you pay for this. You guys didn't, you baby boomers didn't pay your way for a long time. Don't leave me with the debt. And so remember the intergenerational aspect of this, that piling on debt right now, even if it isn't inflationary, is not so great for you guys. And since uh, I'm concerned about my kids and my grandchildren, I actually don't want them with piled up debt. I want the wealth holders in our society to do more. So I believe we should pay our way much more. Even if we could get away with the borrowing, I don't want to get away with all the borrowing we can get away with, because it leaves the debt for future generations. And it isn't exactly progressive just to say, don't worry about the deficit, because the deficit is fine if interest rates remain super low. But I doubt that that's also going to happen, because interest rates, for reasons we don't really know fully, fell to near zero. And so the amount of cost to service the debt, to pay the interest on the public debt, really fell even as the debt rose a lot. And so you might feel, don't even worry about that part. The servicing is going to be low. But I have a general principle, which is when you don't quite know why something very unusual happened, don't expect it to stay that way necessarily. So just on first principles of economics, I would bet that interest rates rise back to more normal historical levels. And for that reason, I think that this debt is going to be a bigger burden in the future, and we ought to keep it under control, not by not doing the spending, because the spending's a priority, but by raising the taxes on people who can afford it, and not build up the debt on young people. And by the way, interest rates are starting to creep up already with these big packages, which I fully support. And I don't listen at all to, or listen, I don't like at all, I don't agree at all with the Republicans saying, oh, no, no, you can't go on with the deficit. We shouldn't spend this. What they should agree to is, since we can't go on only by borrowing, we should raise taxes. But the Republican mentality is, no, low taxes is the most important thing. But that's not the most important thing. A safe planet is the most important thing. A fair distribution of income, every child having a decent education. These are important things, and we can afford those, and we should pay for those, especially people of great wealth, especially corporations, which have made huge profits and have put their money in the Caribbean. Let's put that minimum tax on.
Well, and there's, obviously there's a ton of corporations that have made these profits by polluting the planet and by warming the planet. And some of these companies that have done so are some of the biggest and most powerful in the world. And so much of America's inability to transition away from fossil fuels is a result of these companies' lobbying power, their power over politicians. Is there anything that makes you think that the efforts of these companies to maintain their power in this status quo is going to be thwarted this time around?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I am no fan of ExxonMobil. I'm no fan of Chevron. I hope they're not sponsors of the podcast. I
They
don't
are
think
not.
they are. Koch Industries and all the rest, they've gotten away with creating disaster. And they propagandized on that for a long time. And I do believe there should be an income tax surcharge of these companies, so that the remaining bucks don't just go to the shareholders, but are used for all of the remediation, for all of the costs that these companies have imposed knowingly, not before climate science was telling us, but afterwards. In the last 20 years, they've known all about this. And we need to charge these companies so that the damages that they've created are at least partly covered by this kind of funding. This is really important. Now, you asked, will this time be different? And I think the answer is yes, for several reasons. One is the climate risks are more dangerous now than ever. and more apparent now than ever because we're seeing disasters everywhere. Second, the alternative technologies are better than ever. So photovoltaics, wind power, onshore, offshore, and so forth. This is a huge advance to get these costs down. That makes things a lot more favorable as well. And advances in electric vehicles, for example, have made Tesla the most valuable auto producer in the world, overtaking GM, Ford, all of the giants, because the future is with clean electric vehicles. So I think we've hit the tipping point. It doesn't mean we don't still have resistance and foot dragging and lobbying and delay and a Republican Party that is still pretty much owned and operated by the oil industry. But it's getting to a point where you see in the stock market, the share valuations of Exxon and so forth have come way down because the market's looking forward and saying, we're going to bet on solar, we're going to bet on Tesla, we're not going to bet on fossil fuels, which have seen their day.
Well, if you had a wish list of things that President Biden could accomplish in this administration's terms, what are some of the things that would be at the top of that list?
I think he's going to accomplish them, by the way. So I'm pretty optimistic. But I think we need to set on a course of sustainable development in the United States. So we need to establish the principle that we're going to decarbonize by 2050 and that we're going to invest to accomplish that. We need to establish the principle that we're going to have an inclusive society. So we need to plan on fair tax increases to pay for the social services and the infrastructure that will make our society fair. I think we have a real chance for transformation now. Transformation in the US comes in waves. The New Deal was a wave that changed our politics for basically 35 years from FDR coming into office in 1933 to the end of the Johnson administration. And then we had a wave towards the conservative side, which tried to cut the role of the federal government, stop the infrastructure, denied the climate change. That really started in earnest, in my counting, in 1981 when Reagan became president and said that government is not the solution to our problems, government's the problem. He campaigned against the government that he led. And this started a very harmful process that's lasted a long time. And I hope, and I believe it can be the case, that Biden is leading now a new turn towards the kind of activism we need for a fairer and more productive society. A lot will turn on the next elections as happens. You know, he'll do a good job in this next 2 years. And then will the American people support this new direction in November 2022? If they do, we're really going to make a historic breakthrough in the right direction.
I definitely hope so. Well, you've recently started a new podcast yourself called Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs. What are you hoping to get out of these long form conversations with experts in a variety of fields?
Thanks for mentioning it. I'm having a blast because I'm reading great books, especially the COVID period. I think a lot of us have. I'm into audiobooks now, which I had never done, but you got to walk a lot during the COVID days. So out in the park. And I'm speaking then with these authors who are absolutely amazing, world leading historians. I love the histories that I've been reading and the historians I've been talking to, and people who are making breakthroughs in ideas, new concepts. So the idea is new books that are really exciting. And for me, it's just a lot of fun to chat with the authors because I've met some people that I did not know before, and they're absolutely fantastic. So I'm having a blast with it.
That sounds wonderful. And we will link to the podcast Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs in our show notes. Professor Sachs, is there anywhere else online that our audience can follow your work?
Well, you can follow on jeffsachs.org. So if you'd link to that, that just has my articles. I tend to pipe off a lot, every couple of days, trying to write an op-ed someplace, and CNN. I have a regular column, and Project Syndicate a regular column, and these days a lot of speeches on Zoom and so forth. So please jump in, join the conversation, and I'm easy to find on email also, and this is a time when we need a great discussion. So I really appreciate being with you on climate podcast, because it's so terrific. And what you're doing to help everyone understand our situation is fantastic.
Well, as a longtime follower and fan of yours, it was an absolute honor to speak with you today. Jeffrey Sachs, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
It's great to be with you. Let me get that right. Climate Pod. I know it's a podcast, but Climate Pod, and absolutely fantastic to be with you. Thanks so much.